Our last class together, the theme was intimacy with our inner life. It was really how suffering arises from the unseen, unfelt, and what I often call unlived parts of ourselves. And that it's not until we become aware of what's there and embrace it. And by embrace it, genuinely bring presence to what we've been running from, that we discover a kind of wholeness that really is the equivalent of freedom. So intimacy with ourselves, opening to what we haven't opened to. Tonight, this class, I'd like to take this exploration and bring it outward and explore, what does it really mean to be intimate with the other beings around us. And the same exact principle applies, which is if our heart has shut down to an individual or a group of individuals, if in some way we are discounting or rejecting, not attending to, not including in our hearts others, some part of the world we call other, we are not living from a place of wholeness. It creates suffering. So I'd like to explore that, really how we can't be free if we're shutting anybody out of our hearts. And I find that when we're rejecting others, when in some way we're closed down to others, we're not aware usually that it's creating suffering for us. That's not where our awareness is. Our attention's fixated on something's wrong with you. So we're not aware that that fixation actually has contracted our hearts. Now, there's a little more likelihood that we're aware of it when we get caught in a very strong kind of cycling resentment. And sometimes we really get it. God, I'm really caught in this. And we can feel that it's squeezing us. And you might just reflect for a moment to see if this is true for you. If you're aware of the suffering that comes with resentment. So I'm having you jump right in, right at the start, which is by asking you, if there's someone that you're feeling blame towards right now in your life, just to check it out for a moment. Somebody that you know very well, or it may be somebody that you don't know personally, but you're feeling hostility towards, blame, resentment. Bring that to mind for a moment. And the examination is who we become when we're inside blame. So you might run the storyline of, in some way, how this person is being hurtful to others or hurtful to you, or in some way letting you down, how this other is not okay. So that you can use that to sense, well, what happens in my body when I'm blaming? What's your body feel like? And what does your mind feel like? What's the quality of your mind when you're in blame? And in a deeper way, what's your sense of yourself? What's your sense of your being, of who you are, when you're in the mode of blaming, resentful stories, anger? Do you like yourself? Do you feel at home in yourself? Sometimes we find it gives us a surge of power. We actually feel good because there's a reason anger is addicting. So that's why you keep on examining. What's it like? Who are you when you're angry? So it's something you can continue to examine on your own, but what we find is if we're willing to pause, when we're angry and blaming, our attention's fixating outward. If we turn the attention around and say, what's this really like for me? It's our heart that's squeezed. It's like we may be hurting the other person, but we're hurting ourselves. This is not a message that anger's bad. Anger is an intelligent emotion, and it's got a message for us. And if we're not caught in the storyline, it can actually guide us. But when we're caught in the storyline, we become small. I want to know, how many of you noticed that? You could just sense you were living in less than who you know yourself to be. Can I see by hands? How many of you noticed that? Yeah. Okay. It's an interesting examination. Most basically, when we're living in resentment, we've separated ourselves. In that contracting, we've pulled away from our belonging. This is part of what we're going to explore. Now, there's the anger, blaming, or resentment that we can feel in our relationships, but then there's another level of pushing people out of our hearts. And this is the domain that the group White Awake is exploring, where there is, in some way, who we are is being filtered through stereotypes, and who others are is being filtered through stereotypes, and we're often not aware of them. And what I mean by that is we've in some way clustered a certain group of people as different from me, as either inferior or not so worthwhile, or in some way bad or wrong, or we have some kind of aversive notion, dangerous, Now, to some degree, unless we're free, and by free I mean unless we've really woken up to all the influences of our culture on us, we are influenced. And influence is a light word. We're shaped by these presuppositions about who others are. And it's a little scary when you think about it, how very instantly our minds make associations. We clump people. We think we know things. That we profile. We do automatic profiling. Scary. Scary because we're not aware of it, and when we live inside it, it creates separations that prevent us from opening to something that we've touched, that we cherished, which is a sense of being at home in a heart and awareness that really are tender and awake. There's a tightness, a smallness. So we do it on all sorts of levels. I mean, and it's usually very unconscious. I know that when I pay attention when I'm reading the newspaper, which I don't do all the time, but when I watch myself as well as read the newspaper, I watch myself, and it's appalling is a word that comes to mind this moment, how every moment I'm like, whatever I'm taking in, I'm categorizing as this is good, this is bad, this is a good person, this is my type of person, this is a bad person. It's like, this is just going on, this blah, blah, blah in my mind that's making these categories and turning people into yeses and nos and rights and wrongs and goods and bads. It happens to us. It happens to us. Now, politics is a big one. It's one of the reasons I want to do this talk tonight. Don't we think we're right? I mean, really? Don't we? There's this unconscious assumption that what we're believing is the truth and others are wrong. Well, we have it very, very strongly with politics, with race, with religion, with sexual orientation, with gender orientation, with socioeconomic criteria, with physical appearance. We have very strong filters between us and reality. So when we're in reaction to others, and again, I'm using two different domains. One, somebody that's part of our circle, so to speak, but in some way they've violated our idea of how they should be cooperating, okay? So when we're in conflict that way, or reaction that way, or whether it's because a political candidate or some other category of that we typecast, we've gotten into reaction to, we've created in those moments what I call an unreal other. So when you're in reaction, whether it's your partner, your child, or a political candidate, or in some more subtle way, somebody of a certain race or socioeconomic, whatever, when you're in reaction, you've recreated an unreal other. And by unreal other, rather than a living, subjectively feeling, changing being with longings and fears and so on, that's dimensional, that person's become kind of an idea in your mind that's, two-dimensional, flat, just represents something really thin. They're just not subjectively alive or real to us. It happens a lot. The more we're stressed, the more it's like we're a player on the stage and we're the protagonist, and everybody else are these like little puppets or pawns or players that are kind of unreal others. And they're either unreal others that are potentially going to help us or potentially going to hurt us, or are kind of irrelevant because they won't do either. Now, I'm painting an extreme, but the more we're stressed, the more we're in a bubble of self and unreal other. And it becomes particularly fraught with suffering when it's unconscious due to the filters of stereotypes. I wonder, as I talk about this trance of unreal others, for how many of you does the phrase unreal other in some intuitive way resonate? Does it make sense to you? Can I see, just so it's kind of feedback for me. So there's some confusion, but I'd say most of you. Also, I think that I'm hoping that those that aren't so sure will find as you explore more, it comes alive. I love the way Henry David Thoreau put it. He said, the real miracle is to see through someone else's eyes for even just a moment. Just for a moment. Because usually we don't pay close enough attention to have others become fully real to us. So there are degrees. And tonight's inquiry really is, how do we create unreal others? Like, how does it happen that others become so two-dimensional, and often there's an aversive, real big distance? And how do we wake up from it? How do we see through each other's eyes? Okay, so the beginning of the inquiry really is just to look in an existential way and get that all life forms are designed to perceive separation, that our brains are designed that way and our nervous systems are. And that's important to know, so we don't feel like we're fighting against this tendency to feel separate. It's not a fight, it's just becoming aware, just noticing. Awareness frees us, okay? So we're born, we're born into it. It's how we're designed. It's part of the evolutionary story. Einstein put it this way. He said that it's kind of an optical delusion of consciousness, this separateness. We have it, but it's an optical delusion of consciousness. He said this delusion is a kind of prison for us, restricting us to our personal desires and to affection for a few persons nearest us. Our task must be to free ourselves from this prison by widening our circles of compassion to embrace all living creatures and the whole of nature in its beauty. So this is the theme, that we have this design to perceive separation and just consider a few people part of us, part of me. But we also have this capacity to recognize that and widen out. Now, what's interesting to me is that many contemporary evolutionary theorists have come to this perspective that the widening of circles is happening, and it's also a built-in part of our design. So we're designed to perceive separation, and also designed to gradually open to have a wider and wider sense of who we are. And so I love it when those that study nature and science come to the same conclusion as the mystics. I think that's so cool. So Darwin basically argued that tribes with many members who are willing to contribute or sacrifice to the common good are more successful in terms of evolution than smaller clusters that are not doing that. And Edward Wilson, in his new book, a very well-known evolutionary psychologist and theorist, described that our evolutionary success is due to the movement towards cooperation. It's our cooperation. It's a widening sense of our identity that's allowed us to be successful, and allows us to solve problems we could never solve. Somebody was just describing recently that how nowadays they're putting puzzles that have been unsolved for like 85 years on the internet, and between different minds from different places, they're getting solved. Medical solutions and all sorts of parts of science, societal problems. It's this bigger intelligence because we are coming together in these ways. So what Edward Wilson writes is that we have two conflicting forces in us, and they're competing actually. And we're wired to be tribal in the largest sense, get more and more altruistic. We're wired for it. We have brains that can have mirror neurons and circuitry that can perceive what's going on for others and can sense the we, the us. It's part of us. And as we all know, we're wired for competition, for individual selection. We're wired to sense it's me against you. I have to prove myself. There's danger, I have to fight. There's danger, I have to flee. So it's both is going on, the separate self and the more communal self. And just to say, the point of this, of widening circles, is not to extinguish our survival instincts. I mean, we need to survive as bodies. It's part of the way we are to have that fight-flight response. But there's suffering if our lives get organized around it. That's the point. That if our identity is just exclusively linked to the surviving self, we will always be at war. We'll always be at war. So it's also described that, the more we're in that narrow affiliation of self, it's me and it's the world out there, are a very small tribal. Because one of the things with tribal is that tribal, if it's not big, then thinks it's better than another tribe, right? Okay. So when we're in this narrow identity, we don't have access to the parts of our more recently evolved brain that can be mindful, that can be compassionate, that can listen, and that can see through each other's eyes. When we're caught in stress and feeling separate, we can't see through each other's eyes. I think that's really interesting. One of my favorite illustrations, some of you might remember this, I shared it last year. About a century or two ago, the Pope decided that all the Jews had to leave Rome. Naturally, there was a big uproar from the Jewish community, so the Pope made a deal. He would have a religious debate with a member of the Jewish community. If the Jew won, the Jews could stay. If the Pope won, the Jews would leave. The Jews realized they had no choice, so they picked a middle-aged man named Moshe to represent them. Moshe asked for one addition to the debate. To make it more interesting, neither side would be allowed to talk. The Pope agreed. The day of the great debate came. Moshe and the Pope sat opposite each other, and for a full minute before the Pope raised his hand, then he showed 3 fingers. Moshe looked back at him and raised 1 finger. The Pope waved his fingers in a circle around his head, and Moshe pointed to the ground where he sat. The Pope pulled out a wafer and a glass of wine. Moshe pulled out an apple. The Pope stood up and said, "I give up. This man's too good. The Jews can stay." An hour later, the cardinals were all around the Pope asking him what had happened. The Pope said, "Well, first I held up 3 fingers to represent the Trinity." He responded by holding up 1 finger to remind me that there was still one God common to both our religions. Then I waved my fingers around to show him that God was all around us. He responded by pointing to the ground and showing that God was also right here with us. I pulled out the wine and wafer to show that God absolves us from our sins. He pulled out an apple to remind me of original sin. He had an answer for everything. What could I do? Meanwhile, the Jewish community had crowded around Moshe. What happened, they asked. Well, said Moshe, first he said to me that the Jews had 3 days to get out of here. I told them that not one of us was leaving. And then he told me that the whole city would be cleared of Jews, and I let him know that we were staying right here. Yes, yes, and then asked the crowd. I don't know, said Moshe. He took out his lunch, and I took out mine. So it's like this, right? Okay. Okay, so thus far I've been describing, we have this design to be separate, to feel separate, to out of stress, really focus on something is wrong, and not to be able to read each other very well. It is deeply amplified through our culture, this sense of separateness, and the society we live in, through its standards and its stories and its attitudes. It's like we're like fish in water. We are not aware of the imprint of how much it shapes our reality, the ideas and standards of our culture. We're so accustomed to the judgments. Creates huge suffering. And I'm going to do some of an emphasis on the suffering of race because it is so deep and so injurious. And I thought what I'd do is share with you, because we're really not talking about the imprint on us of our culture when we might not even see it. And I want to share with you a blog posting. And this was offered by an African-American man who's been now a part of our community for a few years, and his name is Travis, and he shared this with me after he posted it. He had just come to one class here, and the next day, this is what he wrote. I want you to hear it. When I arrived, it was a little early, so I sat down at the end of the second row and began to read a book I had purchased and awaited the meditation to begin. The building slowly filled to capacity, and it seemed by the time the meditation began, every seat in the house was filled except one, the one next to me. I was a little set off by this until the ghost of racist past sat down next to me. I became very distracted by the ghost sitting next to me. He said, empty seats are devoured in this hall, so why am I sitting next to you? As meditation began, the ghost in the empty seat continued to whisper in my ear. His rap filled my mind with anger and frustration. Trust me, reader, you don't want a ghost in your ear during meditation. He will throw off your sense of concentration. I ignored the ghost and turned my focus to the meditation, and for a short period I was able to rid myself of this ghost and the feelings he invoked. The feelings of mental preoccupation returned within a few minutes. Why am I the only person to sit next to you? Do they think you would rob them, he asked. No, that's absurd, I replied. I don't think they felt that way. The ghost responds, maybe you have an awful smell. No, I was clean. You look intimidating? I don't believe a 41-year-old black man in dress pants and button down creates fear and intimidation. Is it because you're new? I don't know. The situation bothered me for the rest of the evening to the point that I did not and could not follow the rest of the Dharma teachings. And I remember the teacher announcing that volunteers were needed with the tea and snack table. It was my intention to help out, but I thought to myself, they don't want a black man to help. So right after the service was over, the ghost of racist past escorted me out. He wrote some more. I'm just going to read a few bits because I want to share it with you. He said, last night surprised me because of the atmosphere and environment. Why? In a sanctuary of community and meditation, would these fear-based beliefs exist? And then he says, most people would agree that stereotypes are unfounded. Nevertheless, race-based stereotypes and human attributes are found in all races. It's the elephant in the room. Then he says, when we do not bring issues of race and racism and prejudice into mindfulness, we give way to or deepen the trance that holds us in fear of one another and our differences. This blog is not in any way intended to offend or alienate white people. Rather, this blog comes from the perspective of a black man who loves deeply and with a divine passion. Namaste. And he ends, I'll see you next week. So thank you, Travis. I didn't expect to feel this, but it really, I feel just the way that I did when he first sent it to me, like right after class. It just very raw and sad. It's like we each have the conditioning. Psychologists know that if something's repeated over and over again, it doesn't matter what it is, something in us, once it gets familiar, assumes there's some truth to it. And of course, politicians, political campaigns take that and run with it, right? Just repeat something, or just pick something to make somebody else look bad or to make a point, and just say it again and again. It doesn't matter if it has any ground. Well, that's how stereotypes are built. It just doesn't even hit our consciousness that we're believing that some people they look a certain way, they're weak-willed. If they have certain orientation or preferences, they're perverted. They look a certain way and they're dangerous or unintelligent or greedy or immoral, Now, there's a lot of victims of stereotypes. I focused on Travis's story, but so many of us, in different ways, probably have felt marginalized, that we don't meet the mainstream standards. I'll bet you if I did a hand raise, most of us, at least at some part of our lives, found ourselves in a situation where we were an outsider and were, a victim of how others were looking through a filter that was not true. I think of one friend who shares to me what it was like to grow up as a gay man and the shame of a secret of always feeling different. And another woman who's a very dear friend struggled with weight all her life, and she says that wherever she goes, it's people are seeing her fat body. That's her experience, and it's actually got a lot of truth to it. A son of friends who feels ostracized because he's not at all athletic, or others that are diagnosed with cancer, and this is getting less so, but the C word. And then I think of my mom, who's 86 now, and she describes being in a group or talking to somebody, and the intention, it's as if she's invisible in some way. She's just old and people aren't thinking she is as important anymore. It's heartbreaking. Now, not all of, we have a lot of assumptions about people, and they're not all, the unconscious ones are not always harmful. I mean, we might have certain, correlations we make in our mind, like, most, if we think to ourselves, professional dancers are thin, or lawyers are logical thinkers, or people who entertain regularly are extroverts. I mean, we might have things like that that are just, not always true, but they're not harmful. I think of this story. I heard a blonde woman speeding down the road in her sports car. She's pulled over by a woman police officer who happens to also be a blonde. So the blonde cop asks to see the blonde driver's license, and she's digging through her purse and getting progressively more agitated. "What does it look like?" she finally asked. The policewoman replied, "It's square and it has your picture in it." The driver finally found a square mirror in her purse, looked at it, and handed it to the policewoman. "Here it is." The blonde officer looked at the mirror and then handed it back, saying, "Okay, you can go. I didn't realize you were a cop." So in a way, what I'm getting at is that it doesn't cause suffering. We have these ideas, okay, blonde cops, whatever, but they still limit us when we have these ideas because we don't really look as deeply to see who's here. We just make these correlations, and the person becomes a certain type. And another story, there's two sisters of a very strict religious order. They're shopping at a local convenience store, and as they pass by the beer cooler, one says to the other, wouldn't a nice cool beer or two taste wonderful on a hot summer evening? Second answer is, indeed it would, sister, but I would not feel comfortable buying the beer since I'm certain it would cause a scene at the checkout stand. So the first sister said, well, I can handle this without a problem. And she picks up the six-pack and heads for the checkout counter. The cashier has a surprised look on his face when the two sisters arrive with a six-pack of beer. We use the beer for washing our hair, the sister said. Back at our facility, we call it special shampoo. Without blinking an eye, the cashier reaches under the counter, pulls out a package of pretzel sticks and places them in the bag with the beer. He then looks at the sister, winks, and says, the curlers are on the house. So in a way, I'm being playful, but uniforms and dress are powerful symbols, and it's easy to lock into ideas about who's here. We see a policeman, and it's either for us, depending on our history or whatever, this is a pig or this is a hero, I mean, it's like it can swing. And, I think of for myself that I spent 10 years in an American Sikh ashram, and for those of you that don't know, the American Sikhs wear white garb, all white, and turbans. So I spent 10 years, and they don't cut their hair. That's one thing I haven't gotten over yet, but the rest of it I have, because with the garb. But that's a long time to be moving in the world and always being dressed in a way that makes you look different, and everybody's got a filter on how they're looking at you. And at times it was really difficult. And we had people calling us towel heads or cone heads, and we got ridiculed a bit. I remember going to graduate school in my garb and being the only one, and how much I had to work to have people, kind of on some way say, hey, I'm real. I'm not that different from you. I'm into this particular spiritual practice, but hey, here we are. I had to work really hard to have them see past my whites and my turban. It was painful. I felt like other. I felt the unreal other. Even more painful, that after I left 25 years ago, so it was a long time ago. Ever since 9/11, my Sikh friends, especially the males, Osama bin Laden, they get taunted. And then the horror that happened just last month at a Sikh Gurdwara. We see people look a certain way and make associations that are often painfully derogatory. You're not only different, you're bad. You're not okay. So the point really is that we're not free if we feel excluded, if the ghost in our ear is whispering, you don't belong here, you're different, you're not welcome. And we're not free if there's some ghost whispering in our ear, that other person is not okay or not worth paying attention to or less than you. What comes to mind when you say to yourself, oh, very poor person in third world country, in the city begging. What comes to mind? It's like, is that a real person to you? Or do we have an idea? Can we begin to imagine seeing through that person's eyes? We very quickly flip to very narrow stereotypes. So often it takes our own painful experience of being other, or else being very close with people who have been really subjected to the big suffering of being outside the mainstream and had their lives in many, many ways, feeling the shame and humiliation that comes from a culture with ideas that put certain groups down. If our close friends, somebody close in our family goes through it, then we start waking up to the suffering and caring enough to begin to really deepen our attention. if it's our sister who comes out as a lesbian, or if it's our male child who wants to wear a dress, you know. One woman very, very dear to me, she's in our community here. I remember her coming to, she very rarely comes to Wednesday night, doesn't feel comfortable. African-American woman, single mom. Remember her coming once, we had a question-answer period, and she was sitting here. We've been talking about teaching our children to trust their goodness, to trust their belonging, okay? Which is something we teach a lot. And she raised her hand and she said this. She said, in my neighborhood, drug dealers line the streets, and our black boys are often on a straight track to prison. Maybe teaching my boys mistrust, being afraid of themselves in the world, might keep them safer. Broke my heart. Because she has boys, beautiful boys. And I started thinking, well, what if that was me? And what if it was my son living in a culture where people looked at him through the filter of, oh, this is a dangerous young man who's potentially a criminal. If that was one of the first things somebody might think, or if he was the one that was going to get pulled over much, much more frequently if he was driving. Does this make sense? But it took her, somebody that I knew personally, to sense the mom in me going, wow, that hurts. You know, there's more African American men in prison now than there were slaves in the 1850s. It's going on, it's right here in our country, you know. So the inquiry, both personally in our lives with our own friends, where we're resentments and so on keep us distant, and with the people around us that we, without even knowing it, are distancing. How do we widen the circle of compassion? How do we do it? And what I've found for myself and working with people a lot on this is that it always starts with the kind of practices we were doing last week, where we sense inside us how we've turned on ourselves. Because if we're not able to open to the places of shame and fear and hurt and guilt inside our own bodies and hearts, we do not have that courage and presence to be with the suffering of others. Okay? So that's the starting place.